All right, hi. My name is Miranda, and this is Allie over here. We are your research chairs for the National Youth Alliance. Hey. So this session's going to be a little bit different. We're kind of putting two things together that you wouldn't really think go together. But this session, we just kind of, like when you get put in this situation, like there's so many things you can do to just be proactive with your life. And by being here, you're already doing so, taking a step in the right direction because you want to learn, you want to do more. And so that's kind of what we wanted to gear this session towards, focusing on being proactive with research and the things that you can help with by participating, and then also when it comes that time to being proactive by thinking about family planning options. So we have myself here, Allie, and then we have Jeff and Megan. They're going to also talk to you guys about family planning as well. This is our disclosure. I don't know what it's for, but and we're going to kick it off with one thing we wanted to focus on in particular for research is Enroll HD, just because, there's many different research trials going on out there, but this is the one that probably 99% of you in this room could be participating in, and this study is also going to help all those other ones, so it's really important that we are participating in it, and it's our age group, like the NYA group, that they need the most. So we're going to talk to you about what it is and why it's important. And Allie's going to kick it off.
Right. Just that one? Mm-hmm. Sweet. Okay. So Enroll is a study. It's a worldwide observational study. You have to be 18 to participate, but anyone can do it, whether you're positive, negative, not tested, a family member. It's a pretty cool study. They are able to really get a lot of data from this one. So in the past 5 years, this is kind of the trend of recruitment. The estimate currently is there are over 15,000, and I think over 5,000 of those are symptomatic, with the other 10,000 being all the other categories. So what is Enroll? It's a global research platform to speed up progress with clinical trials, understand more about HD, and improve care. So it has three main goals. We want to improve our understanding of HD and find out other factors that might influence the progression or the age of onset. To enhance the design and expedite the conduct of clinical trials. So if they find things that might, like if they find a drug that might help that's already approved for something else, they could test it in HD, and since it's already approved for safety purposes, they can do a faster trial. To foster good clinical care and improve the health of participants would be the third goal. Who participates? Kind of already talked about that. Basically, everybody. Yep. So what's involved in an Enroll visit? So there's the consent process first, basically making sure that you understand exactly what you're doing and that you're comfortable with everything. And then you have a blood draw in there so that they can test your blood, which you don't get the results from. And then you also have a series of like cognitive exams and motor exam too, right? Yeah, okay. Yep.
So with participating, one thing I hear a lot is that for people who are at risk, they are afraid that somehow that they're going to find out whether they are positive or negative. So it makes them nervous to go because they say, oh, if they're testing my motors, if they see something off and don't tell me, I feel like they're going to treat me like I have HD, but I don't know or not. So when they draw your blood, they are testing to see if you have it or not. The person who is doing your testing literally has no idea. So that sample gets sent to someone who is sitting behind a computer testing it. They will never meet the person that did your test. They will never meet you. You will never meet them. To them, you are just a number. So the person who is testing you, their job is pretty much just to do that test. They're not trained to diagnose you. They're not trained to do anything. So that person It's not like, if they know that you have it or that you don't, that they're going to treat you differently or it might make it more awkward. They honestly have no idea what it is if you're at risk. And so some people, like even when you go, they don't want to know whether or not you have it because then, like for them, it might skew how they look at your results. So they don't even want, if you know what it is, they don't even want to know. So I know that makes some people nervous, but I wanted to kind of ease your nerves if you decide you might want to participate.
So we have a couple pictures of some of our board members that have participated in Enroll. The majority of our board has actually participated. Yep. So what does it collect? It collects a common set of information for all participants. So there's some family histories, a blood sample, the results from your cognitive exams. And then they're all coded and are released every 2 years for people to analyze, but there's no names connected to any of it. It's all de-identified data. So data sharing is essential for developing therapies for HD. At the University of Iowa site, we have a pharmacist who takes the Enroll data and analyzes it and just looks for trends. And he's able to do that because of this data sharing. There are the coded clinical data and biosamples collected from Enroll participants are made available to researchers in one site. It's a very easy process, and this encourages a broad variety of ideas and projects. So, I don't know. Okay, I was going to say I don't know what this one is. There we go. So this is the data from 2016. The new numbers will be released, I think, at the end of this year. And originally in 2016, we had 8,000 participants. It's over 15,000 now. And then these was just kind of the breakdown of all that stuff. Yeah, you please.
Another thing this slide's trying to explain too is that, at a center, if they have a lot of people who do participate in Enroll, once these bigger clinical trials start to come to the US and start to expand, they pull data from Enroll. And if they see the University of Iowa has a lot of Enroll HD participants, so if we take our clinical trial there, that means we're going to get a lot of participants. So I'm from Michigan, we don't have a center of excellence, but our university still participates in Enroll. But, if they look at my area, they'll see, there's only a couple people that are participating. We shouldn't take our trial there because we might not get as many participants. So all these other clinical trials do look at Enroll for data, for participants. And so that's another reason why Enroll is really important, because this is kind of the stepping stone to get to all those other trials. Yeah.
I was just wondering, if we don't have a center of excellence in our area, and we also don't have a university that participates in Enroll HD, what's the process there?
So, a lot of people used to think that if you don't have a center of excellence that you can't do Enroll, and that was another reason we were having problems recruiting. But like I said, I'm from Michigan. We don't have one. One of our universities does participate and still do it. If you visit the lovely lady sitting outside at the Enroll HD table, she has all the sites that do it. So she can give you the address, she can get you in contact, and if you get in contact with them, I know some trials, if you're from far away, they'll give you an incentive to come out to them. So they can work with you if you're a little bit further away.
As far as the initial appointment goes, is it just a one-time appointment that you would have to go to and then you wouldn't have to go back? Because I'm thinking if I have to go far away, then I wouldn't necessarily be able to go back for another appointment. Does that make sense? Okay.
So when you go, I did my first appointment this year. So like Allie was saying, when you go, you start off with the, why am I losing the word? The consent process. So they just let you know that they're not using your data for anything else, that no one will ever know, that no one will ever find it. So you go through that process, sign some papers, then they do your cognitive testing, so you do some puzzles, and then they do motor. So when I was there from start to finish, I think I was there for maybe 2 hours, and for enroll, you do it annually. So, and it'll keep going for as long as Enroll HD is still around, that if you're enrolled in it, and they'll give you a call when it's like coming up, they're like, oh, it's almost time for your appointment. So it's once a year, and it just takes a couple of hours.
So I actually work at the University of Iowa, that's why we keep referencing it. And it is an annual thing, but there's also like a really big buffer zone. So I think it's like 3 months either way from like the date that your like 1 year would be. So it's really easy to schedule another appointment. It's like they're really flexible. They're really good at working with you to like make sure that your schedule works to be able to go back in. But yeah, it would be an annual thing. Okay. We've already talked about that. Okay. So the hope for the next 5 years is we want more people that are in the categories of at-risk and pre-manifest, because that's where we're really struggling, like Miranda said earlier. We want to transition current participants in more advanced stages to an easier protocol. So people that are in their later stages of HD, they want to make an easier visit for them so that it's a little bit less hard on them. They want to utilize mobile health apps to accommodate younger, working, and remote participants. So kind of like where you said you might not be able to like go to a place, they're working on it, hopefully within the next 5 years. Okay, so what can you guys do? So the Enroll site is actually like a really easy to use site. There's a lot of good information on there. You can tell other people that you might know that might be able to do Enroll. Just try to get involved, even if you don't think you can do it personally. Even telling another person that could is still super helpful. Yeah, I don't know what that is. Okay, so we'll transfer that to you.
That baby makes me laugh. But so just my 2 cents. Oh yeah. Before we wrap up, that was kind of our research portion. So like she was saying, it's our age group that they really want to try and get more involved. And make sure you visit the lady out front. She can tell you where you can go. And so, yeah, that'll be it for Enroll. And we're going to... Yes, all centers of excellence do it. Yep. There's 161 sites. I did not know that. Fun fact. All right, so we're going to switch over to family planning, another part of being proactive when you're in this situation thinking about your future. So another reason we wanted to kind of do this is I know a lot of people are big fans of in vitro and PGD, which we will talk about. But I also wanted to go over all the other options because I know some people don't really have access to do IVF. So I wanted to also go over those too. So we'll do that and then roll into IVF. So adoption. I don't know a whole lot about how the process works. I'm sure if you got in contact with your local chapter's social worker, they could always point you in the right direction and help you out trying to figure out that process. But of course, that is always an option. I wanted to include this too because we have a question.
Wouldn't knowing if you have Huntington's make it harder to adopt?
I know you said you know a lot about this.
So I've kind of been looking into it a little bit. I'm in Ohio, so I don't know like where you're from or how it's different. But there's multiple ways to go about adopting. So when I started talking to people about my situation being positive for HD, they said that if you go through like an attorney and do a private adoption, typically you don't have to provide that information. The most you might have to do is like a physical exam with a doctor that just says you likely won't pass away in the next 10 to 15 years, and most doctors won't know you have HD if you don't tell them. But then there's other routes through agencies and through the state that would do more digging into your medical history. So just depends on where that information is for you. And if you're at risk and don't know your gene status, then you don't necessarily even have to tell them.
I also really wanted to include this too. It is okay to still want to just have kids naturally. I know some people think it's not, and I've heard a lot of people say that they have been told that it's not, but I do just want to include that it is okay to still want to plan to have kids naturally, especially with all the research we have going on. You know, there's still hope, and if you wanted to have kids naturally, there's a lot of hope for them too. And you know, that's how most of us got here anyways. So. Sperm donation. So say the male in the relationship is the one with Huntington's. So the mom, she can get sperm donated to her so that he essentially doesn't have to use his genes. So it would kind of bypass him being able to spread it. Same likewise, if it's mom that has HD, you can also do egg donation. It works similar to how they do the in vitro process, that if there's just somebody out there who's donated their eggs, all those people are usually don't have any medical conditions, so they can use someone else's eggs to have a baby. There's also prenatal testing. There's 2 different kinds. So if you are pregnant and you decide there are ways that while you are pregnant that you can still find out the gene status of your baby inside you. One of them is chronic Vasila sampling. So this one's a little bit more invasive, that they go in and where your baby's being held, they can scrape off a piece of it because around it actually holds the DNA, and then they will test and they can see the gene status. The same way they do it in amniocentesis, it's the needle would go into your belly, into where the baby's being held, and they can pull out that fluid too to also test gene status. Do you want me to describe it, or you want to take the floor? So we are really lucky to have Jeff and Megan here today. They've been through the in vitro PGD process, and they wanted to talk to you guys about how it works and how their process went. So I'm going to hand it off to them now.
Thanks, guys. I was just going to add something that I think with those prenatal testing things, one thing to keep in mind is that most centers will only do those tests if you confirm to them that your intention is to terminate a positive pregnancy. So if you get a positive test result, if that's not your plan, most places won't do prenatal testing for you. The logic is that like you can't test kids against their will, and so if you got a positive test result, right, and you were carrying a baby, then you would, once the baby was born, that kid will have already basically been tested and be born with already knowing its status, which is kind of against the rules. That brings me to PGD. I feel like I'm doing like a commercial. No, I feel weird because I'm sitting down. It's like we're in a... No, this is casual. This is nice. I like this better. Is this okay? Can people hear? Okay. So we're all friends. We'll keep it casual. So I'll just talk about the procedure a little bit, and then maybe Megan can tell her story because she kind of lived through more of it than I did. Like everything in life, reproduction is way harder on women than men. My part of it was like, well, anyway. So the way PGD works, basically, it's just like, so if you've ever known someone in your family who's gone through in vitro fertilization, it's basically the exact same thing, right? So they take a sperm collection from the male, which is easy and doesn't trouble him at all, and then they collect eggs from the women, which Megan will describe, and it's a little bit more involved. Do you want to say something now? I have visions of them collecting the eggs. It's non-trivial. It's not easy, and it's comes with some discomfort and stuff. But then so they've got the eggs and the sperm in the lab. They actually do this funny technique where they have to take a single sperm and inject it into the egg, and they do that so that there's not extra sperm hanging around the outside of the egg. Because then if they did a test and they tested the wrong sperm that could lead to a bad test result. So they inject the sperm right into the middle of the egg, and then they've got however many eggs they have fertilized, and they just let them grow in the lab. So normally if you were doing IVF just for fertility reasons, like at that point they would like put the embryos in the woman and hope for a pregnancy. In this case, they let them sit in the lab for a few days. And the reason they do that is so that it starts to divide and you don't just have an egg, but you've got like 8 or 10 or, some number of cells. And one of those cells is biopsied. So like a super talented technician puts it on a microscope and grabs like a little mini, oh, cool. That's exactly what it looks like. Takes like a tiny little suction cup and grabs one cell off of the developing embryo. The way our embryos divide, this is fine. Like it just divides again and then it's replaced. It doesn't, like the kids aren't missing like an arm or something. Because sorry, I'm going on a whole biology tangent here in my head, which I'll stop doing. But so in humans, it's fine. And so then that single cell gets sent usually to a specialized central lab. So the lab that did our testing is actually in Detroit, although we did our process in Vancouver. And the reason is these tests, right, they don't get to screw up the test and do it again. They have one cell to test. And so they're going to test that cell for the presence of the HD mutation. And so basically like they overnight the cells, one from each of the embryos. I think in our case there was 8. And they take them to Detroit and they tested them, and the Detroit lab runs their test in a couple hours and calls the lab back and says basically like embryos number 1, 2, and 10 or have HD and the rest of them don't. And then you're sitting there and they say, do you want to implant? In our case, they asked us if we wanted to implant 1 or 2. They don't really, most places don't do that anymore, I don't think. Twins are a handful, it turns out. And then they basically implant and they hope for the best, and they hope that it takes and that you have a successful pregnancy so you haven't done anything to the embryos. You haven't like modified their DNA or something. You've just identified the ones that don't have HD. So the questions that we get asked a lot. Well, do you want to tell it from your side, what it was like? Because it's probably useful for people to like hear about the experience. Maybe. Do you want to?
Yeah. Who wants to hear about the experience? Everybody, okay. So, it started off with a doctor's visit where Jeff and I went in there. We're like, okay, we're going to do this thing. And we were all gung-ho. We're like, we're going to have twins. We're going to knock it out of the park. And reality hit, and the doctor and the counselor described to us the process. And then they started talking to us about all the things that will happen, timelines. And then they talked about the fact that it might not work. And so we went home that night really just, confused. And are we going to do this? Maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe we should still try naturally and do amnio, So that sort of like realization was like, oh, well, this seems really easy and straightforward. Like this just looks like it should work all the time, but it doesn't. And we know several people now who have done this process and it hasn't worked for them, or they've done it multiple times and, the first time it worked, the second time it didn't, or the, first 2 times it didn't work, and the third time it finally did. So once we finally decided to commit, and they had actually talked us out of twins for the very reason that twins are hard. And we're like, okay, well, this changes things. We can freeze one. If it works, we sort of freeze the rest of them, and then we'll have another option later if we still want another child. So the process is, I go in and they give us sort of like a practice injection. You have to take, is it hormones? Hormones that will regulate the female's cycle so that they can sort of like track your progression. And you have to do these, like it's actually a really sort of like short time, but it's a very intense time because you have to do it every day. And what they're doing is that they're trying to make your ovaries produce as many eggs as possible. And they actually described it to me as it will feel like you have grapefruits in your abdomen. And it really did. Like I was sore, I was tender, I was giving myself shots every day. I want to say it was only for like 5 to 10 days, but it was, emotionally draining. And bear in mind, I don't have HD. I'm doing it for him. uh, so then what came next? And then they sort of like tracked my progression and said, okay, you have, and I think we started off actually with like 16 viable embryos or viable eggs.
So I have to interject to describe the guy retrieving the eggs. Megan's OBGYN was this like very like manly guy doctor. And they retrieve the eggs like using a needle, and they give this. The woman's kind of on pain meds. She was pretty high because they have to kind of go and like they use a needle, and they're seeing on ultrasound because you can see these follicles where each of the mature eggs is, right? And so he's like steering this little machine around, and they're using the like little needle to get each one. And he's totally looks like he's playing a video game because he's just like choo 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 choo, got it. And Megan's like, what's happening? Anyway, that was a fun part.
That was not the fun part. The fun part was the fact that I'm pretty sure that he had chest hair and he was wearing gold chains.
He really did.
He was like one of these 70s sort of like. But it wasn't all that fun. We weren't having fun. No, so they figure out how many you have. They figure out the time that they're going to retrieve them. And they told us all along that what they retrieve, that's not what you're going to have. And I want to say that we had a pretty sort of like 50-50 split the whole way through. Like they retrieved X amount of eggs, and then they only had so many eggs that they could test, and then they only had so many eggs that survived. At the end of it, we had 2 eggs and
Without HD.
2 eggs without HD. And we had like 2 or 3, I think, with. So it was about, half and half. Okay, so we finally get to the point where they're going to implant babies the blastocysts, the embryos, and they, how they had talked me out of twins before. They said we have 2 viable embryos, and one of them is already starting to look less viable because they sort of like peter out over time very quickly, and they said, "Do you want 2?" And at that point, we had already sort of like prepared ourselves for 1. We quickly had to change our minds, and we're like, yes. And then within a very short period of time, I got sort of like the confirmation that, yes, I was indeed pregnant, and that I had really high levels of the thing, whatever, the hormone that tells you that you're pregnant, which they said is probably twins. So that was sort of like the process.
Oh, I should interject
Oh.
something. And I should say that the process has changed a little bit subsequently, at least at a lot of clinics. There's nobody like tracking this information, so it's not like there's a good place to go. But I know a lot of clinics, and I had a friend go through PGD recently, and at least at that clinic, you have the option of freezing all of the embryos because they're better at freezing and thawing them now, which sounds weird, but works. And so they don't have that like, okay, you have to make a decision today whether you want one or whatever. So they basically freeze all of them, at least at some clinics, test them, and then you have like a whole month or however long you want to wait. So I have friends that just had a baby without a genetic disease, and they still have healthy embryos frozen, and so they can go through another cycle in the future, which is a much better way to do it. So I don't know how widespread that is, but that's something different that's happening at clinics. Sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, does anybody have any questions about the process, or like emotionally about the process?
It's really hard
Yes.
on me.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
They're recording it, so they need you to, so they can hear you.
I know a young girl, and in fact, I referred her to your site, who tested positive for Huntington's, and she wanted a baby. She is pregnant, and the deterrent to this young couple was the cost of in vitro. So that was their decision. She's 27 years old, and her mom had Huntington's. Her brother just tested positive as well. So I think, and I work at a healthcare center in upstate New York. We opened up our neuro care clinic unit actually 2 years ago. We are the only neuro care inpatient program in upstate New York. So of course, there are local people who have Huntington's disease. They're younger people as well as older folks. So these questions do come up. And I know her dad, as well. It's a family friend. So how do you, I guess, and it may be different in the United States. I know one of my friends went through in vitro 20 years ago, and it was very, very expensive. So how best do we, should this happen again, what best advice can we give someone? This is a young couple. They have, they have jobs, but they're not great jobs. And they want children, but there's no insurance that covers this, correct? In vitro? Okay. Thank you.
So I don't know of like the answer to this question. I mean, for us, we were in a position that like it's not like we had extra money, but we kind of were able to take it out of our house or whatever, and make it work. But we did it in Canada. I mean, and so even though there's a civilized healthcare system in Canada, we paid out of pocket. It cost us $24,000. And that was our cycle, right? And so had that cycle not worked, you pay it again. And some places there's a discount on some of the parts of it if you redo it. But it's a lot of money. So first of all, like in this situation, it doesn't sound like those folks have that kind of resources. I do get a little frustrated when people are driving around like $60,000 cars and say it's really expensive to do PGD. I do wonder about people's. Anyway, I wonder about people is what I'm saying. But some insurance do pay for it. So my friend I just mentioned that went through PGD, she's a scientist. She's very persistent. And she called her insurance company and basically like talked to the guy above the guy, above the guy, above the guy, and just kept saying like, this is stupid for you guys not to pay for this because otherwise this person has a 50% chance of dying expensively. And her insurance company paid for it. And so it's not so much that they won't, they probably won't, but it's worth trying. And don't take the first no as like the answer, because sometimes there's a guy who will answer the phone. I don't know it's a guy. Sometimes there's a person who will answer the phone and say yes, and that has happened. And I, as a community, I wish we had if I had a wish list, I'm just making this up for the HCSA. Like if we had a way to have like a scholarship for PGD or something, I mean that would be one of the best things we could do to prevent HD. Because I agree with you, it's a tragedy that people make this decision for, understandable but practical reasons that are kind of frustrating. Sorry, it's a long answer.
Well, and I also think that there's a huge youth movement that's happening that wasn't happening 15 years ago or even 11 years ago when Jeff and I were thinking about having children. And I think that it's probably a proactive thing for your community to, go to whomever, I don't know, senators, statesmen, and sort of like say, this is a thing that needs help or it needs attention, and what can we do?
You're more optimistic about the American political system than I am. Other questions about PGD? Yes.
So if one member of the couple is at risk but doesn't want to be tested, can that couple still go through this? And the second part of it is, if you tell your insurance company that you need to have this paid for because you have a chance of having passing Huntington's on, is that going to make it less likely for them to be interested because it's Huntington's? You're already revealing something that sometimes is not good to reveal to an insurance company.
You know more of the explanation than I do.
Yeah, there's a procedure called non-disclosure PGD, which is like they basically do a genetic test and they don't really tell you the results of it. They just tell you either have healthy embryos that we can implant or not. So that's definitely not all the places do it. I think not all the clinics that offer PGD will offer that, but there is that option for people who don't want to know their own status. And so basically, like the doctor just tells you there's either healthy embryos to implant or not, and you don't know if not, you don't know if it's because they had HD or because they didn't, they weren't successful in the lab or whatever. So that's an option. It's I think halfway through the egg retrieval thing that we just described, you might be questioning your choices about whether you wanted to know or not. And what was your other question? I'm sorry. You had a second question. Oh, yeah. Outing yourself to insurance. Like I'm out. well, I'm all kinds of out. Like, so I forget to be careful about this. But if you were not trying to tell your insurance company about IHD, you would definitely have to tell them, because they're not going to do PGD for no reason. So you would have to have that on your file already. I'm in a database, it turns out. The life insurance companies share a database of like bad people. Yeah. So you guys, and I have to apologize. I have another thing because this is the HTSA and I have 20 things. So I'm going to leave Megan to talk about emotions and feelings and stuff. And I have to run to go to my next thing. But if you see me and you have questions for me, feel free to grab me the rest of the meeting. So I have to run, but not everybody does. Bye.
Bye, love you. Yeah. So, I mean, does anybody else have what? Oh.
So after you were pregnant, did they follow you more closely to monitor your pregnancy, or did it kind of after that carry out as a normal pregnancy?
I'll take Jeff's. So my pregnancy was not an easy pregnancy. So they didn't do any follow-up. There is the option of doing now the amniocentesis once you become pregnant as sort of like a check. Like they gave us that option. But because I had twins, I was at a whole bunch of other risks. I was on bed rest for 3 months, and then my children were in the NICU for another 2 months because they were born prematurely. So again, like all of these decisions we made because Jeff had HD, and this was sort of like the train ride and partly train wreck that were all because of like this one thing that we wouldn't normally, like we would have just normally had children and had our lives, and so.
I guess my question is, how did you guys come to decide on PGD versus some of the other options that you had?
So when Jeff and I met, I had no idea about Huntington's disease. He knew about it sort of like tangentially, that a family member had died from it, and he kind of knew that his mother may or may not have been at risk, and she told him that she wasn't at risk and that she did not have the gene. Turns out her priest had told her that, and that information was wrong. So when we got married, I had no idea, and he had no idea that he was at risk. We came home. We were living in Germany at the time. He was a soldier. And we came home for Christmas for leave, and his dad sat us down and said, "Your mom has Huntington's disease." And we're like, Jeff flew off the handle, and I didn't see him for about 6 hours for the rest of the night. And I'm just like, what is going on? So fast forward, like, I guess Jeff gets out of the Army, we move back to Vancouver, BC, and he's like, I think I'm going to get tested. And that's when we started talking about kids. We started talking about, well, if I have the gene, Jeff was very sort of like Emmett, he did not want to pass this down. So we had actually pretty much, we had decided, I remember him getting his results, sorry, and it was just like that door completely shut for us. Like it was just, we closed it. We lived like the next 3 years, or I guess 2 years, thinking kids are not in our future. They're not, he's now obviously a scientist, and I was in art school, and I was going to go off and go to grad school and get my master's. And we were just like, okay, so this is our lives. We'll keep still doing all of the Huntington stuff and still like keep reaching out to people, but kids, not our future. And then his mom was the one that she kept sending us articles about, different ways to have children, because she knew that we were not going to have children. About, it's just like, oh, you can do the amniocentesis, and, or you can adopt, or, like all of those options. and then we started to, probably because of his research and what he was doing and how plugged in he was, PGD, I think, was relatively new for Huntington's, and he's like, there's this one other thing that we could do. And in the middle of all that, his granddad, who is very, very close to, got sick of brain cancer. And all of a sudden, we're like, all of these people are not going to have like grandchildren or great-grandchildren, and we need to get on this. So we just kind of found a way to do it, and we just sucked it up and did it. We still, believe it or not, are always living like paycheck to paycheck and day by day, and partly because like this is our life. So
I don't mean to be personal, but how old are you and your husband?
I am 43, and he is 40 this year. So, or he's 40, yeah. I guess, how old is I? 32. So, which was probably also one of the things that, you know, added to the fact that I was pregnant with twins. Had I been, you know, 20. They're actually turning 12 this year. Sorry. I'm 43. Oh, yeah, I turned 44 this year. Doing the math in my head.
His health is still fine?
His health, I mean, he has Huntington's disease. And yeah. There's the prodromal symptoms. Jeff and I strongly believe that Huntington's disease doesn't start at, you know, it doesn't start at a single like moment in time. That it's kind of a disease that's always with you throughout the rest of your life.
She has shown signs, but there were minor signs over the years, like movement disorders, but they weren't real progressive. But you know, the last 2 to 3 years, they turned quite bad. And so for many years, she lived with movement disorders, and we saw neurologists who treated her. And then she was diagnosed about 1.5 years ago, and it was confirmed. But I mean, I guess the only reason I was asking was curiosity's sake, because I have 2 daughters, and neither one of them show, which is good. But they haven't chosen to be tested either. I mean, so, you know, I look at your husband, he looks fine, you know, and hopefully he'll be fine, you know. But I'm just curious on asking, that's why.
Yeah, no, so we definitely thought about timing, obviously. His CAG is 42, and we can kind of sort of like, you know, we know the window that he would start sort of like presenting sort of like, you know, real. Yeah. Yeah, and so we kind of said, well, we would like to see them, he would like to see them through to college, you know, and it's still, yeah. With the research going on, we're hoping he's going to see them through to getting married and maybe having their own children, right? So, but if I was asked, would we do it again? Yes, absolutely. Right now, we would do it again. So, yeah.
She's 60 now, and she still manages to walk, but not so good anymore. And we've seen a progression of the disease in the last couple of years. So that's, but she's still going around, you know.
Good. Sorry.
Okay, so for me, my husband and I have, you know, always wanted children. We're really young right now. I'm 24, he's 25. But like, obviously we're looking to the future and wanting to have kids. But I haven't been tested yet. And it like, it really freaks me out to get tested. Like, I don't know what I would do with that information. I don't know what I would do if I were positive. I think it would be really hard on me emotionally, and I don't think I'm ready for that right now. So I don't know. I guess my question is like, what? I don't even know what my question is. But I guess, what advice do you have for somebody who is going through that, and how would you advise them to move forward? I guess, I don't know.
With having children? Oh, yeah, I know, and I mean, it was obviously something that we talked about too, because it's like, well, if he does have it, for us, like, because we had just been married, and at that time, you know, career choices and things like that. Do you know that the day that he got his result, he actually asked the neurologist for a job? That's why Jeff is in science. He actually asked the neurologist for a job. And because we're in Vancouver, and we had Michael Hayden there, who was like a really, he's a prominent figure in the HD community and research. And the neurologist's like, let me, you know, talk to Michael Hayden for you. And he went in, and so I guess what I'm trying to say is that A, you have to be ready, and B, you have to sort of like have, I think, a game plan. I think a lot of people go into testing without sort of like knowing how they're going to, you know, like move forward with some of these things. So that's my advice. Oh, yes, good. Thank you.
So I guess like my advice for you too would be, I mean, there's plenty of people who, you know, go through their life just being at risk because they're comfortable there. And I know a few people who are in their 30s, 40s who are just at risk because they know that, you know, knowing something would not be well for them. So they are just comfortable being at risk. And so like Jeff was saying, there's if you wanted to still do PGD, they can do it without letting you know your gene status. And like some of the other options too, like adoption or naturally, like you wouldn't have to find your gene status either to go through those options as well. But
Like, not going through PGD without actually knowing my status seems really wasteful, especially coming from, like, you know, somewhere where I'm probably not even going to be able to afford it, and if I can, then I'm going to be doing a lot of strenuous things financially to get there. So doing it without actually knowing if I'm positive or negative would not really be a great option, just because I don't want to have to, you know, spend a bunch of money or put my family through a bunch of stress if I don't have to. So that's kind of where I'm at.
So I did test positive, like I said earlier, but I've kind of been thinking about this too, because we don't even know if we want to have kids. But I'm 22, and I've started the process of just looking into what it will cost, or what the process will even look like, or where I might go, even if I'm not actually going to do adoption or PGD in another like 5 to 10 years. So I think in your position, that might be a good route too, just like looking into it or coming up with some sort of savings plan so that when you do want to do it, you can do it right then. And then if you end up like wanting to test, you might be more emotionally ready for that by the time that you have the funds for one of these other options.
Sorry, I was just going to pass it down here first, and then I'll get to you.
Another thing about getting tested is that it's a process. If you go to a center of excellence, it'll be months. You have a visit, and then a month later another visit, and they recommend that you have a counselor in between to process all this. And one of the goals of that whole process is for you to explore how you're going to feel with either result. And at the very last minute, the last time you go and they tell you the blood test result, you walk in the office, you can say, I don't want to know. But you will have benefited from all of that process and counseling. And it might help you to see how ready you are to be a parent anyway.
sorry.
So I have a question about insurance, which is, I don't know that I'm sure you're very knowledgeable, but I don't expect you to be an expert. So you had the IVF in Vancouver, so was it free then, or how does that work? I thought I heard at camp that in Canada you get one try free. Nowadays they've changed it so you get one try free. I have no idea. I'm not from Canada. But just basically insurance-wise and cost-wise, how did you guys do that? And yeah.
So in Canada, weirdly, it's not free. You would think with our sort of like progressive healthcare system that we would have free, like we're saving the government, thousands, if not millions of dollars for the care of this person later on in their life. We had, well, what was it? Jeff got hit by a car riding a bike, and he got a settlement, and so we put some of the money away from. No, this was a different car. And I got hit by a dump truck. I know. We do. I don't ride my bike anymore. I'm like, yeah, something's trying to kill us. So we actually had like an influx of funds, and we're like, yes, this is what we're using those funds for. So luckily, and because we were going to school and because he was in the military, he was also getting a GI Bill. Our like cost of living in Vancouver, even though it's an extraordinarily expensive place to live, I already had a condo from a previous car accident that I was in. so our, yeah. Does have get thrown out of jeeps and land on your head and you'll be just fine. No, you won't be. Actually, weirdly, both my husband and I now have head injuries. What else? So, yeah. So, I mean, we took funds and we made sure that it happened. And because of like our living situation, we were students. We were actually like living cheap. We could actually like live off of $50 a week if we had to. So.
A question about the insurance. I know Canada has different insurance than over here in the United States, but now they know your husband is positive for Huntington's. Is there any repercussions of that from the insurance companies? Or are they still willing to cover him for any of his ailments? And because over here, if some insurance companies find out, they may cancel you.
So I don't know if this is like across all insurance companies, but the insurance company that we have, and I can't remember the name of it, you might have to ask him, that he applied for life insurance because he got tested in Canada. He wasn't in the database yet. He wasn't known to have Huntington's disease. So when he applied, he was cheeky. He applied for insurance and got life insurance. And if they don't take it away after a certain period of time, they have to honor it. That's not life insurance. Yeah. What about health insurance? In Canada, we don't really have health insurance. So, yeah. Yeah, we just go to the hospital and have babies and walk out of the hospital at the end. It was, no, there was nothing. Like my bed rest, 3 months in the hospital, in my own private room, nothing, no bills, nothing. Kids in the NICU. Even Jeff was like surprised by this because he is American. When we left the NICU, he's like, "You mean we just walk out with the babies?" I'm like, yes, we just walk out with the babies. That's what we do. Like, he's like, they're not going to give us a bill, and I'm like, no. So there was another question about insurance. Oh, in Canada, the other thing is like you might have heard this from camp. I think there's one province, and I think it might be Ontario, that will do a cycle of IVF, but it's not So each province has their own sort of like healthcare system. So.
Okay, I have just two quick questions. The first one is, do you know anything about egg donation versus in vitro cost-wise? Because we are military. I know they showed it up there. I didn't even know about that. So I was just curious, like, is that like around the same cost? Do you know? Do you guys know? Anybody? Yeah, well, our military, they don't cover any type of, it's not medically necessary, so they will not cover it. So I was just curious about that. And then the other thing is, we didn't have as much knowledge about HD as we do now, and we already have one child that we had naturally. So my question is, morally, how do you emotionally, like, how do you deal with that? Like telling your kid, well, we didn't do that for you, but we went through this that's like a huge thing for us that we're like, what do you do?
So my sister-in-law, she got accidentally pregnant, and her boyfriend at the time decided to continue on with the pregnancy because they felt like they were morally responsible, like they did this, and this little being was like, was here now, and they had to deal with it. And they questioned, they struggled, they thought about it long and hard. They decided to keep. They have since gotten married, and Miles is wonderful, and they're like, we want to have another baby. And they knew the process that we went through, and they were like so scared that we were going to be judgy, and we were slightly disappointed because we're like, well, one way of thinking about it was like, would Miles want his brother to have HD? So that was like one question. But then the other question, they ended up having Alden without going through PGD as well, and also both wonderful babies, wonderful kids, and we wouldn't honestly trade either of them for anything. So, it's so personal. So.
So I'm not necessarily like married or anything, but I've always wanted to have kids, and I just recently got tested and found out I have it. And in my family, it's an earlier onset, being around symptomatic at around 30, and my mother passed away just around 49. Do you think it'd be a good idea to still try to find a way to have kids? Because that's what I've always wanted.
These questions are very emotional. I mean, it's such a personal decision and such a personal choice. And I mean, for me, if I was in that position, I would try to look for ways to have children. Yeah.
I'd say the way that I like to look at it too is that like if my mom had the same debate, like, oh, I have Huntington's, like if she decided that she didn't want kids because she had it, like I wouldn't be here, my brother wouldn't be here, my sister wouldn't be, and like I want to be here. So it's like, I mean, we won't talk about you, but like, so it's just, you would have to kind of think about that way too, that, if you had a kid, like they would want to be here too, and they would still have you. And so I think, it's up to you, obviously, but. Any more questions? That is another option, foster care. Okay, so I actually think it is just about time. We're over time. So I'll just wrap it up real quick. So don't forget to visit the lady out there who's got the Enroll HD table. She can tell you where you can go for a center. And yeah, if you have any other questions throughout the weekend, we're all here, so you can always ask us questions. And don't forget about the talent show tonight. Thank you for coming.